Ladies and gentlemen, this is us. This is global air transportation. This is our supreme network across which we transport 5 billion passengers in segments and 69 million tons of cargo that helps feed the world. This is a supreme network. Now, the internet is actually a similar network. Yeah, similar almost amounts of users, and although it doesn't transport humans yet, maybe, it certainly does transport trade. More and more of trade and services is delivered digitally. And this is actually something that helps us protect the global economy from some of the impacts of tariffs in the current environment. Both of these networks are like global arteries that bring the oxygen to the global economy. And we know that it's really damaging to the body when we block our bodily arteries. And therefore, it is just so surprising that we have the current increase in fragmentation that we have in the world today. Tariffs are a form of fragmentation, dismantling the international trading system, and they are now at their highest level since the 1930s. ESG reporting doesn't necessarily affect everybody in the same way, but there's at least 10 global frameworks and over 1,000 metrics asked of us all to be able to report upon. CORSIA and EU RED, why are these two systems competing with each other when they could just offer mutual recognition? Taxation, we all know that ICAO resolutions cover the taxation of international air transport, but then there are all these organizations that now want in on this game, either out of ignorance or deceit. All of this will lead to less growth in the global economy, just like blocking our bodily arteries would lead us to have less well-functioning bodies. We predict that global growth this year will be around 2.5% instead of the 3% we predicted at the end of last year. We predict that the US economy will grow perhaps 1.5% instead of the 2.5% that we predicted at the end of last year. Now, it's really lucky for us all that oil prices are so low, because thanks to the lower oil prices, global growth is not going to be lower still, because lower oil prices help prop up activity, helps keep the blood flowing in our global arteries. And this will help to some extent global growth, and it will certainly help to some extent the performance of airlines, which of course still have the cost of jet fuel as the largest cost component that airlines have to grapple with. Now, if you're a European airline, though, you are a lot less fortunate, because in Europe, the oil companies are putting additional fees on top of their normal fuel bill, simply in an attempt to cover themselves for any risks or damage that they might incur in the future from the mandate, the SAF blend mandate of 2% in the European Union, and a similar mandate, of course, also in the UK. So this is not only increasing our costs, it's completely not transparent in terms of the pricing of the fuel. It's a, a self-determined fee imposed by the oil company, and we do not necessarily know what it's supposed to correspond to. We also don't get necessarily the documentation for these supposed SAF purchases that we need in order to be able to claim those costs against our obligations. So now we're paying, we're not necessarily being able to claim, and we're not necessarily seeing any cuts in CO2 emissions. And perhaps the worst thing is that it robs us of our right to self-determination, because in this way, airlines cannot decide for themselves how they are to procure the SAF that they may wish to procure. So this is clearly fragmentation at its worst. When policies do not work, we need them to change quickly and adapt and learn from these lessons. Everybody can make a mistake, but let's all just agree to not propagate these mistakes any further and make the same mistakes over and over again. Now, in spite of all of those headwinds and complications in the global economy and costs going up for airlines everywhere, we still have a remarkable, I think, traffic growth on our forecast of 5.8% for this year compared to 2024. And as we already said, that represents about 5 billion in terms of segments of passengers and 4.3 billion origin destination passengers, and clearly shows how much people are demanding air transportation in spite of the complicated economic and geopolitical environment. And most of this growth also comes from Asia Pacific. Cargo, we think, is going to eke out a positive growth rate of 0.7%. It's not a very large number, I admit, but it's still a positive and strong number given the tariff environment that we are facing, and 69 million tons is the volume that we're expecting in 2025. On the back of those numbers, airlines should be able to realize revenue of 979 billion, a bit less than the evocative 1 trillion that we were hoping for at the end of last year, but still large enough to generate an operating profit of 66 billion in 2025, where oil prices again are making up for some of the otherwise generalized cost increases, totaling 913 billion for the industry in 2025. Most of this revenue comes from the passenger side. That's the big red block that you see. The share in total revenue is 71% from the passenger side. The share in cargo is the blue line, and at 14% share, it's still higher than the share in 2019. I think that should give every cargo airline person some degree of comfort. And then perhaps the most important incremental growth is indeed in ancillary revenue. Even if the share is only 15%, still it's a rising share. So a blue skies scenario for sure, you could say, with a net profit of 36 billion and a net profit margin of 3.7%. So blue sky scenario for sure, but still we have to recognize that this is a low margin industry. Incidentally, before I comment on this slide, you know, the 5 large oil companies pretty much make as much profit in one single quarter that our whole industry makes in the whole year. Just saying. So we take our 36 billion and we see where they come from regionally, and most of the billions are indeed generated in North America, 12.7% of the 36 billion, and Africa is still the continent that is the most heavily impacted by the fragmentation that is so pervasive on that continent. And and that continent is unfortunately just barely positive. Now, per passenger, it yields a slightly different distribution across the regions, with the Middle East having a per passenger profit of just over $27, and again, Africa generating just over $1 per passenger. Again, showing how important it is to have margins. Now, for the industry as a whole, this gives us $7.2 per passenger, but we understand, again, that we are uniquely resilient as an industry, and that's fantastic. But if we want to be as uniquely robust and be able to withstand crises, perhaps before we face them head on, then we need higher margins. And with that, I thank you very much for your kind attention.